Hello, everybody, and welcome to Grey History. Episode 95, Vendée, Nantes or Nothing. Having recapped the outbreak of rebellion, it's time to jump into the chaos. From the highs and lows of the Great Insurrection, this episode will unpack the first 3 months of the war. After that, we'll be ready for the march to hell and back and the atrocities which followed. But in order to explore those events, this podcast needs your support. If you're enjoying Grey History, please consider supporting the show today at patreon.com. With ad-free listening, bonus content, and a range of other perks, this is your chance to help keep the show on the air and make history that isn't black and white. So support the show today, and I look forward to welcoming you personally. Now, it's with immense pleasure that I get to welcome the newest members of the Grey History community. A warm welcome to the newest virtuous citizens, Blake, Eliane, Michelle, Ryan, Dondrit, Gustafsson, Andrew, Nick, Mike, the Lassiter, Adrian, and Andres. Another warm welcome to the newest true revolutionaries, Pico Lacido and Allison. And thank you to Mira for increasing their pledge and becoming a true revolutionary. Finally, one last welcome and huge thank you to the latest champion of the people, Scott. Of course, thank you to every member of the community and a special shout out to the marvellous heroes of the revolution, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, and Kevin S. Before we begin, I just want to say one last thank you to everyone who has been leaving reviews, contributing one-time donations, and supporting the show by sharing it with friends, family, and strangers on the internet. Revolutions need people, and I can't thank you enough for your support. On the 4th of March, 1793, the peasants arrived in mass. The district was gathering in Cholet, and important issues were at hand. A week earlier, the National Convention had decreed a levy of 300,000 men. The war required soldiers, and the district was required to provide. In accordance with the directions from Paris, the people could choose the method. Perhaps young men would draw lots, or perhaps the community would vote on volunteers. Ultimately, these citizens would determine their answer, but their reply was unexpected. With each passing hour, the crowd became agitated. The demands for the war were unpopular, and so too was the republic which made them. The National Guard was on hand to suppress dissent. But as their officer appealed for calm, the militiaman was knocked to the ground. With blood now shed, force restored order. Yet, with tension smouldering across the region, these scenes in Cholet were far from isolated. Riots were soon erupting, and rampage became rebellion. 2 weeks later, a band of insurgents seized Cholet. Outnumbered 20-1, the Republican guardsmen were defenceless. Insurrection was the order of the day. As similar disorders flamed across Western France, the question now was simple. How would the Republic respond? By the spring of 1793, the revolutionary government was no stranger to unrest. Recruitment riots were widespread, and the previous years had seen no shortage of disorders. Given this, while the Western disturbances were troubling, the situation seemed manageable. After all, misled peasants were no match for brave and true republicans. Convinced that a show of force would reinstate the convention's supremacy, the task was passed to the unfortunate General Marcé. A veteran officer loyal to the revolution, Marcé had frantically gathered troops from further south. Departing from La Rochelle on the French Atlantic coast, the port was an ideal place to launch a military operation. But if I was trying to identify the first great turning point of the Vendée Civil War, then General Marcé's expedition is probably the top contender. Up until now, scattered bands of rebels had generally seized smaller settlements. Yes, a few larger communes had also fallen, and the major city of Nantes was briefly besieged mid-March. However, as proven at the gates of Nantes, the insurgents had rarely overcome sizable resistance, especially from the army. Consequently, the government still anticipated a prompt remedy once their troops arrived. That was about to change. Advancing north from La Rochelle, Marcé's force marched into the heart of the western department named Vendée. Joining Marcé was about 2,400 men, mostly raw recruits. Arriving at a sabotaged bridge, the column was forced to stop for repairs. Here, the rebels assembled on a nearby hill, and Marcé opened fire with cannons. But, unfortunately for Marcé, this little expedition had something far more dangerous than inexperienced soldiers. It had political interference. Joined by 2 representatives on mission, one deputy ordered the firing to stop. This order was well intended, yet disastrous. Apparently, the deputy had heard the armed figures singing the Marseillaise, and so he was concerned that Marcé was firing on fellow Republicans. By the time it was confirmed that the armed mass on the hill was indeed the enemy, the sun was already setting. Having wasted a precious opportunity to pound their opponents into oblivion, Marcé gave the order to encamp. It's here that the unique topography of the Vendée demonstrates the potential for guerrilla warfare. With the Republican troops pitching their tents, the rebels used the hills and hedges to secretly outflank the enemy. As soldiers prepared to light fires for the evening, the Vendéans opened fire themselves. Shooting from thick vegetation with deadly accuracy, the result was absolute slaughter. Disorder and panic soon consumed the defence, and the untrained Republicans were forced to retreat. Trampling on each other in their desperate escape, the cries of the wounded mixed with unrelenting gunshots. Marcé's force was decimated. By the time the bloodshed was over, some 500 were dead, while hundreds more were taken prisoner. Perhaps a third of the expedition was lost. Marcé's defeat on the 19th of March, 1793, converted rebellion into warfare. Once confident in suppressing the revolt, the convention was now convinced of conspiracy and reaction. How else could one explain it? Brave soldiers slaughtered by peasants, the French military vanquished by farmers. This was impossible. This was plots, treason, counter-revolution. As such, the Battle of Gravailleux Bridge fundamentally recast the events. Occurring in the heart of the Vendée department, politicians in Paris leapt to denounce the horrors of the Vendée. As discussed in the last episode, fear, alarmism, and political opportunism fast-forged a coherent region from a vast area with no common history. The fact that this inexplicable defeat occurred in the Vendée department gave the broader conflict its name. To put it simply, prior to Marcé's rout, the West was beset with fires. Dangerous but small, the situation was still manageable with prompt and vigorous action. Now, the Republic was driven back. The flames were left to burn. Within weeks, the Vendée was an inferno. Yet, while the convention panicked over the fiery abyss, various rebel leaders saw something closer to a blizzard. For all its force, the wind eventually stops, and the snow melts away. Despite their initial success, the insurgents were disbanding. Easter was fast approaching, and many peasants returned home. With the feast days over, the rebels did regroup, but the problems were just beginning. Untrained civilians are seldom brilliant fighters, and uniting disparate groups was proving extremely difficult. Come early April, the rebels were experiencing setbacks. Multiple bands were defeated by Republican forces, while nearby unrest in Brittany and Maine was quickly being contained. Without renewed success, the situation looked bleak. Something had to change. However, while Royalist whites were experiencing challenges, the Republican blues were enduring their own hardships. Nationally, the convention simply had bigger problems to solve in April and May than the upstart rebels in the West. April saw invasions from Spain, Austria, Prussia, and England, while Dumouriez's treason had upended the command of military forces. In the capital itself, Girondins and Jacobins battled for supremacy, culminating with the purge of the former on the 2nd of June. Thus, throughout April and May 1793, the Republic soldiers went largely unsupported thanks to Parisian fixations on both foreign and factional foes. But, despite inadequate support, Republican troops were making some progress. As just mentioned, nearby disturbances in Brittany and Maine were rapidly being suppressed, respectively north and east of the Vendée. Furthermore, the situation near Nantes was likewise somewhat pacified, temporarily securing the right bank of the Loire. However, south of the Loire River, most of what was fast becoming the Vendée remained problematic. That said, rebel groups were still experiencing defeats. The man initially overseeing most of these operations was a French officer named General Berryer. Berrier's plan was simple. He would keep the rebels in a box. You see, the Vendée was shaping up to be a sort of rectangular region. To the west was the ocean, to the north was the Loire River, and while the south and the east were not contained by geographic barriers, there were a series of notable urban centres which could help create a perimeter. Along the northern border of the conflict zone were other cities and towns, notably Nantes, Angers, and Saumur. With these positions currently secure, Berryer would approach from the east. Along with expeditions from both the north and the south, the Republicans would box the rebels in and slowly push them further and further west. Eventually, they would drown in the sea. For ease, I have put maps of this and the broader campaign on Instagram, Patreon, and in the show notes. I've also put clips up on YouTube and TikTok. Yet, while Berryer was planning a seaside holiday for the summer, some things just aren't meant to be. Despite moderate success in early April, further outbreaks of insurrection complicated the Republic's advance. Furthermore, Berrier's troops were no better than those commanded by General Marcé the month prior. Lacking training, weapons, and morale, the Republican blues often disintegrated at the first setback. Now, to be clear, the Republicans are often called the blues in this theatre because of the colour of their uniforms, whereas the Vendéans are the whites due to the colour of the monarchy. Colours aside, General Berryer was so dismayed by the state of his forces that he often wrote disparagingly of their conduct to his superiors in Paris. I can have no confidence in the troops I command, and if tomorrow I learn some unfortunate news, I will fall back to the bridges. Except for the army corps I command, which is undoubtedly due to chance, all the other divisions have suffered violent setbacks. General Quétineau has been abandoned by his troops. Others are in the same situation, yet these leaders have ability and valour. All these reverses are due solely to the shortage of regular troops. Without this, it is impossible to end the war. The troops I have are composed only of formless gatherings, of fathers of families, who, having barely arrived, ask to return home. It is essential to have the troops camp. It is the only way to maintain discipline and prevent pillaging. There is no army as poorly organised and as poorly equipped as mine. No general officers or staff, not a single rifle in the arsenals, and yet I have to fight the most dangerous enemy of the Republic. Fanaticism is pushed to an extreme here. I repeat to you that it is not newly formed battalions that I need, but troops that have been in the war. Without that, I cannot answer for anything, and it is with the frankness of a zealous Republican that I tell you this truth. But just as the advancing Blues were grounding to a halt, the Vendéans were getting their act together. Forced to cooperate due to earlier setbacks, fresh outbreaks of resistance bolstered both recruits and the insurgency's leadership. Most importantly, some of the largest warbands united, formally creating armies. Critically, not every rebel group participated, but large cohorts were now working together in some semblance of unity. I say some because these armies often lacked one singular leader, and many were jostling for the title. Of these groups, the most important is the so-called Royal and Catholic Army of Anjou and Upper Poitou. Confusingly, this is sometimes named the Grande Armée, but there is no connection to Napoleon. Instead, it was simply the largest of the Vendéan armies, hence Great Army. In addition to greater unity, the Royalist cause was further bolstered by the steady stream of success. Victories captured weapons and ammunition, and further demoralized an enemy already prone to flight. In May, Republican commanders watched in horror as nervous recruits triggered unnecessary retreats. Victory begot victory, and the rebels were on the advance. However, one comfort for at least some military commanders was their short tenure witnessing these embarrassing defeats. With each passing week, commanders were being replaced. Paris demanded success, and the failures of General Berryer resulted in his removal. His successor was the unfortunate General Biron, who was then stationed in the east. I say unfortunate because, like General Marcé, Biron would not survive the guillotine. But that's a digression for another time. For now, Biron needed to transfer to the front, and that meant weeks of indirection. Together with their growing confidence and capabilities, the rebels used this opportunity to score further victories. The response from Paris remained relatively minor. Sure, these events were alarming, but so too was the Prussian, Austrian, English and Spanish armies currently besieging the frontiers. Defeating these foes required every man available. The Vendée would have to wait. Likewise, by mid-May, the Girondins had established the infamous Commission of 12. The result was 2 weeks of intense power struggles in the capital, culminating in their downfall in early June. Thus, while setbacks were concerning, the deputies of Paris simply had bigger problems. Moreover, other cities were preparing to intervene in the capital's anarchy, while Lyon was experiencing its own municipal revolution at the end of May. Facing an opponent that was both divided and distracted, the rebels seized their chance. The pinnacle of the insurgency came in the following weeks. Having taken Troyes and Fontenay, the Royal and Catholic army decided to march on Saumur. Once a stronghold of French Protestantism, the community of about 10,000 had never fully recovered from its mass migration due to religious persecution. Located in the former province of Anjou, Saumur was a notable urban centre along the Loire River. Further east than both Nantes and Angers, Saumur's military value was threefold. Firstly, the Republicans had been using the town as a key staging post, thanks to its position on the northeast corner of the Vendée. Capturing Saumur would thus disrupt reinforcements from Paris, and concerns of a renewed offensive helped to prioritise its seizure. Secondly, Saumur had a bridge to the other side of the Loire River, a huge benefit for the rebels. As the Loire is very wide, the river had been acting as a sort of natural barrier. Consequently, the Loire was preventing coordination with restless regions to the north and east, and some rebel leaders believed that the key to their success was stoking fresh rebellions in the former provinces of Normandy, Brittany, and Maine. Finally, with Saumur on the eastern fringes of the conflict zone, the town was on the road to Paris. Just upriver was Tours, and then Orléans. From there, it was only a short jump to the capital. Should the rebels wish to liberate the boy king, Saumur would be the obvious first step. Keenly aware of its vulnerabilities thanks to recent defeats, Republican forces began preparations. On paper, the Blues' position was hardly indefensible. Bolstered by an influx of last-minute reinforcements, the defenders were further advantaged by both terrain and fortifications. Saumur has a large castle, while waterways and multiple redoubts strengthened key positions. That said, the challenges were still numerous. Pun intended. Estimates vary, but perhaps as little as 8,000 Republicans were outnumbered by 20 to 30,000 rebels. Moreover, the former remained undisciplined and demoralized, while the insurgents were intoxicated by success. Now well armed with both guns and cannons, the royalist whites were brimming with confidence. Knowing that the situation was hardly ideal, government officers did contemplate retreat. Deciding to attempt resistance, the Blues actually did all right. Despite being outnumbered on multiple fronts, the start of the battle went okay for the defence. The southeast of the town was assaulted by a major royalist column, headed by some of their most iconic commanders. However, this flank was guarded by Saumur's castle, along with the troops of Louis-Alexandre Berthier, a future Napoleonic marshal. Rebuffing this assault, it was setbacks on the southwestern flank that doomed the defenders' fate. With the rebels making steady progress, disorder abruptly consumed the Blues. Frightened raw recruits fled in desperation, and their cowardice proved infectious. Republican commanders did attempt to rally their men, and to be fair, those holding Saumur's castle continued to fight on. Nonetheless, the town was lost. Saumur had fallen. Now, the loss of Saumur had huge military consequences, but before them, a momentary digression. The liberation of Saumur's prisons offers one of the many interesting tales of Republican military officers. A certain general had been imprisoned after previous defeats, and although a sincere Republican, the rebels were more than happy to set him free. Why this was the case, and how his subsequent actions see him guillotined anyway, is one of the several grim stories from the era. But if I gave you 100 guesses, I don't think you would manage to predict his saga, nor, for that matter, the wild accusations against General Marcé, who he met at Gravereau Bridge. So, in the episode extra for this episode, I'll be unpacking the unfortunate fate of multiple Republican officers. Yes, most of them do die, but the manner of their deaths, their charges, their trials, their defence is simultaneously fascinating and utterly infuriating. Furthermore, these stories provide a perfect window into a revolution consumed by paranoia, suspicion, and ambition. Thus, make sure not to miss the episode extra for this episode titled Generals and Guillotines. But for our purposes now, what matters is the loss of Saumur. Occurring on the 9th of June, 1793, this disaster was exactly 1 week after the purge of the Girondins. This meant that the rebels' success was achieved precisely as the Federalist rebellions were commencing, with the vast majority of departments currently protesting events in the capital and preparing for civil war. Of course, this coincidental timing allowed the capital's Jacobins to further discredit the Gironde. Clearly, these two-faced deputies were involved in royalist plots. Evidently, the purged representatives were complicit in counter-revolution. If proof had not yet been sufficient, Saumur dispersed any doubt. However, underneath these cries of treason and conspiracy, the concern from the capital was genuine. Saumur had been a key staging post for the Republic's military efforts, and its loss paved the way to Paris. Just upriver was the city of Tours, and after that, Orléans. The Republic had thrown every spare resource at the Vendée, and now the road to Paris was open. Here is how local representatives on mission reported the situation. Take note not only of their desperation, but their shortage of men, arms, and basic supplies. Fellow citizens, the greatest misfortunes threaten us. The bandits are achieving new successes every day. Saumur is currently in their power. Our army is in a complete rout. It falls back to Angers and Tours. General Menou has just arrived here in wounds. His horse was killed under him. Coustard, Santerre, and Berthier are alone at the head of the troops. As soon as Menou is bandaged, he will, if possible, give you an account of all the details of the affair. We cannot anticipate his story, not having been a spectator. Our colleagues from the Central Commission in Saumur will arrive here. We will consult with them on all the measures to be taken. But we must not hide it from you. We have no means of defence in Tours. We have successfully sent all the troops who arrived to Saumur and Niort. We have left, at this moment, only 2 units of the 72nd and 78th Regiments, a battalion from Paris, which was to leave today, and which we have held back. No cannons, very few rifles. Such is our position. We have just sent a courier to General Biron to warn him of our disasters and to urge him to take all necessary measures to repair them. Send us cannons. Let all the battalions arrive by the same route, especially rifles, because the majority of the battalions, except those in Paris, are not armed. The representatives of the people, delegated by the National Convention. So, with Saumur lost on the 9th of June, the Republic's forces were in disarray, with the Federalist cities marshalling their own troops to potentially liberate the capital. The Royalist and Catholic army had achieved unimaginable success. Yet, the conquest of Saumur placed the rebels at a crossroads. Should they march on Paris, or should they go elsewhere? For some commanders, the merits of the capital were clear. Harnessing their momentum to raise other departments, the Royalists could slay the Republic and liberate young Louis XVII. To do this, 2 routes were possible, one initially north towards Le Mans, and the other along the Loire River, starting with the city of Tours. But, despite just hearing the bleak report of deputies currently stationed in Tours, an advance to the east was a risky proposition. Insufficient cavalry could jeopardize the attempt, and peasant soldiers had a tendency to suddenly disperse in great numbers. Should the insurgents leave their home territory, desertion could cripple the campaign. Yet, while several officers opposed the march on Paris, alternatives were abundant. One was to head south, back into the Vendéan heartland. With the Catholic and Royal Army in the northeast of the conflict zone, the Republicans had been making some progress in the lower Vendée. Critically, the Blues had regained control over much of the Atlantic coast. As such, some leaders proposed an expedition south, culminating in the conquest of either Nantes or La Rochelle. Nantes was the mirror of Saumur, a key staging post on the southeast periphery of the war zone. La Rochelle was of course a vital port, and while not the Toulon of the western coast, its seizure would have enabled cooperation with the British. Both options would thus frustrate Republican operations and pave the way for foreign help. Thirdly, in addition to the capital and options further south, there was the Breton option. An ancient province with a distinct identity, Brittany had seen substantial unrest both before and during 1793. If the Vendée was currently an inferno, neighbouring Brittany was a smouldering tinderbox. With the right spark, it too could ignite. Or so the royalists hoped. Moreover, an insurgent Brittany would also enable cooperation with the British and potentially connect the royalist Vendée with Normandy. By mid-June, it was clear that many Norman departments were eager to rebel, but it was not yet known whether their politics were royalist or Girondin. As such, a grand attempt to raise restless Brittany and then join with rebellious Normandy was not entirely far-fetched. The fact that many Vendéan soldiers were actually Breton further aided their endeavour. However, after bitter and divisive debate, the rebels ultimately landed on my second favourite multiple-choice option: none of the above. To be clear, my favourite is all of the above, otherwise known as the British war aims of 1793. Given the peasant backbone of the royalist forces, some commanders wished to prioritise the home front. Despite the success to date, the rebels did not have a secure grip on the Vendée. Yes, Nantes and La Rochelle were options to the south, but for these commanders, the better option was to the west, the region's most populous city, Nantes. Before we can cover the much mythologized Battle of Nantes, it makes sense to introduce the city. Back in 1793, Nantes had a population of about 80,000. This makes it sizable, the fifth largest in the Republic if we trust my maths. A key centre for trade with the New World, Nantes was once the largest port of the kingdom. Consequently, the city was a key hub for tobacco, sugar, and, most importantly, slaves. The result for Nantes was many wealthy merchants, not too dissimilar to those mercantile groups in Lyon, Marseille, and Bordeaux. And that is important. As the revolution radicalized, many of the town's elites had become anti-Jacobin. Be they a variation of royalist or Girondin Republican, local bigwigs were generally no fans of the mountain. Of course, the city's sans-culottes had very different attitudes on how to progress the revolution, and so Nantes, like others, was strained by intra-revolutionary fighting. Now, from the perspective of the Vendéans, the seizure of Nantes had several military advantages. With Nantes being a major port, its capture would enable support from England and abroad. Furthermore, the propaganda value of taking the Republic's fifth largest city would be immense, especially when Lyon, Marseille, and Bordeaux, the second, third, and fourth largest cities, were all involved in their own federalist insurrections. Finally, the complete control of the Vendée would greatly facilitate future operations, be it the rising of Brittany or a march on Paris, a pacified rear and foreign aid would dramatically improve their fortunes. Thus, it was the capture of Nantes which won out after Saumur, and the rebels wasted no time in its pursuit. Just 3 weeks later, Nantes was attacked. Yet, in an important act before their renewed advance, the Vendéans agreed on one last item, one singular leader. Up until now, the Grande Armée had no grand commander. The group had been formed by uniting several warbands, and a variety of personalities vied for control and influence. But in order for success to be permanent, it was recognized that a single chief was necessary. For this, they turned to Jacques Catlino. Now, Catlino is not your ordinary royalist. A peddler prior to 1793, Catlino was neither a former soldier nor a member of the nobility. Yes, he was brave, he was honest, he was sincere, but he was not an experienced veteran. That said, he had proven himself capable over the prior months as a senior rebel figure, and so, in mid-June, he was elected generalissimo. To be clear, others would have liked the title, and his influence in military affairs is a matter of historic debate. Nonetheless, Catlino was the unity candidate, even if he was just a figurehead. Now, the reason for Catlino's promotion is pretty simple. Key personalities could support the humble hero, as could the pious peasantry. Indeed, Catlino's devout faith was a critical selling point. Known for his sincere religious beliefs, the rebel had often made great displays towards the church and the clergy. Sure, there was helping persecuted priests and praying at altars, but my personal favourite tale is that the first canon he captured from the Republic was baptized the missionary. I mean, I'm neither a rebel nor a Catholic, but with a pun like that, I'm tempted. Critically, Catlino's righteous reputation earned him a nickname, the Saint of Anjou. Consequently, his leadership and his brand further reinforced the rebels' holy mission. Moreover, how else could you explain the recent success of the Catholic army except for divine endorsement? However, before we move on to the Battle of Nantes, I do want to note a rather significant irony. As discussed in episode 93, the Vendéan insurgents had adopted much of the revolution's slogans and messaging as it attempted to win support. They proclaimed that their rights as the sovereign people had been violated, and they referred to the insurrection as a duty because they suffered under tyranny and despotism. The elevation of Catlino follows a similar pattern. In an era defined by equality, it was smart politics to enlist a humble peddler. Yet, it was also jarring. In the former royal army, well-connected commoners like Lazare Carnot could only advance so far. Most couldn't even enter the officer corps, let alone dream of being generalissimo. Thus, promoting a commoner, and a peddler at that, shows just how republican the royalists had become. Only through embracing the future could the rebels revive the past. Having proclaimed Catlino generalissimo, the Vendéans were marching west. Thanks to Saumur's bridges, the royalists could now operate on both sides of the Loire River. Consequently, Angers was their next target. A prosperous city of more than 30,000, Angers was located on the north side of the Loire. Stationed halfway between Saumur and Nantes, its seizure was of the utmost importance. Critically, although its fortifications were largely obsolete, the sizable town may have offered resistance. But, after Saumur, Republican forces were scattered, and so the city was outright abandoned. Surrendered without a fight, the Vendéans had claimed another prize, without a single shot. However, the capture of Nantes would not be so easy. A much larger city, garrisoned with at least something, the great western port would be a tougher nut to crack. Acknowledging this quickly, the Vendéans called for help. I mentioned earlier that the rebel bands of the war zone had originally operated independently, and not every group had joined the United Catholic and Royal Army. A cluster of independent groups, referred to as the Army of the Marsh, was still acting alone, focused on the western parts of the Vendée. Now, the extent that these groups comprised a singular force, specifically the so-called Army of the Marsh, is a matter that can be debated. I certainly think that the name risks implying a level of coordination that simply didn't exist. But, for simplicity, this army's most important commander was named Charette. Charette was a former noble and officer in the king's army, and despite his isolation from his peers, Charette had been scoring some notable victories. Consequently, the Grande Armée invited Charette to participate in the Battle of Nantes. With the former attacking the port from the northern bank of the Loire, Charette could surround it from the south. Completely consumed by 30 to even 60,000 rebels, Nantes would surely fall. Well aware of their desperate situation, the atmosphere within the city was one of dread and despair. For months, city authorities had pleaded for assistance from the capital. For months, the replies were mute. Historian Michelet criticizes the convention for their inaction, and for him, both the Girondins and the Jacobins did nothing for the city. Distracted by events elsewhere, Nantes was cut loose. Any triumph would be its own. The state of the defence becomes more dire with further examination. Firstly, Nantes itself was hardly impregnable. In fact, the city had actually demolished parts of its walls as the port rapidly expanded in population in the century prior. Furthermore, while its castle did remain standing, it too was largely obsolete. With waterways and marshes interrupting any coherent entrenchments, the city was designed for commerce, not conflict. Secondly, the defenceless defenders were divided amongst themselves. Nantes was no different to the Republic's other large centres, and that meant factional struggles. At a time when Girondins and Jacobins were fighting in Paris, Lyon and Marseille, similar dynamics were occurring here in the West. Described by one scholar as engaged in a fierce war, the competing factions had briefly united when Nantes was besieged in March 1793. But 3 months was an eternity. Since then, the Girondins had been purged in Paris, and Federalist rebels had seized the chief regional cities. Girondins in Nantes likewise wished to rebel, and political feuds had already seen attempted purges of the city's more radical militiamen. Furthermore, those same Girondins refused to work with many of the Jacobin agents of the national government, now that their Girondin deputies had been purged. Whether they would be willing to do so under a renewed siege remained an open question. Thirdly, even if the city had both walls and unity, it lacked the means to withstand an assault. Remember, Paris had not been sending sufficient soldiers, weapons, or foodstuffs, with key resources redirected to foreign fronts and, more recently, the new Federalist revolts. With nearby forces remaining seaside to protect against a rumoured British invasion, troops to defend the city were pitiful. Against a force of at least 30,000, likely more, stood a defence of maybe 10,000? Of that, perhaps less than half were professional soldiers. Deprived of training, discipline, weapons and supplies, the protectors of Nantes were hardly prepared for success. Lastly, alongside the Republic's warriors were its citizens. lots and lots of citizens. With the countryside ravaged by royalist rogues, refugees had poured into Nantes with anything they could carry. Of course, what had not arrived was additional food and supplies, further straining both the military and civilian authorities. With women, children, and the elderly cramped into the city, the scene was not too different from Helm's Deep. Except, just to reiterate, Nantes lacked solid walls, a fortified keep, and perhaps most importantly, a white wizard. But, to be clear, I have a much higher opinion of the Vendéan rebels than I do Orcs or Urukai, although others do not. Historian Jules Michelet believed that nothing would have stopped the hatred of the peasants, nor the fury of their pillage. Now, such sentiments were shared by the trapped civilians, and that increased the fear and restlessness in the city. However, I personally think that Michelet's claims are a tad unreasonable, but I'll explain why in future episodes when we further explore the conflict's atrocities. So, divided and destitute, the city of Nantes had been abandoned by the nation. That said, it did have three things in its favour. Firstly, Nantes benefited from some exceptional leadership, both military and civilian. On the military front, there's the likes of Conclus, Coustard, and Bessières. Of course, none of these will remain in command throughout the entirety of the war. Some were former nobles, while others were executed for their Girondin sympathies. I'll save that for the episode extra. For now, these capable soldiers were allowed to do their job, largely unimpeded by local and national politicians. Speaking of politicians, the Girondin mayor Barcot was quite a remarkable figure. Although no friend of the capital's Jacobins, he was instrumental in bringing unity to Republican factions within the city. Bold and vigorous, some jokingly called him King Barcot, and this firm Republican would lead from the front lines when the assault commenced. Finally, I should also remark on the presence of Maurice, a tinsmith. A patriotic sans-culotte, Maurice would command the more radical elements of the city's militia, and to great effect. But in addition to the city's leadership, the defenders had two other advantages. Thanks to Mayor Barcot and the likes of Maurice, the competing Girondin and Jacobin camps briefly united for the cause. I stress briefly, as they will start killing each other within a matter of weeks. Nonetheless, this momentary truce meant that local revolutionaries were united in the port's defence, enlisting volunteers throughout all social classes. This was no small development. In fact, for historian Jules Michelet, it was vital. If the defence had been entirely military, Nantes would have been lost. If it had been bourgeois only, and by the National Guard dominated by merchants, traders, wealthy people, etc., Nantes would have been lost. It was necessary that the bare-armed, the rough men, the workers, should violently take sides against the brigands and become an avant-garde. The bourgeoisie would not fail to act equally by emulation. This is precisely what happened. Finally, in addition to capable leadership and temporary unity, the protectors of Nantes had luck. Lots and lots of luck. But, for that, we should commence the assault. With multiple rebel armies converging on the city, the decision was made to launch a coordinated attack. Peasant forces were ill-suited for sieges, and Republican reinforcements could arrive at any moment. In broad terms, the advance occurred along three key points: from the northwest, from the east, and from the south. Theoretically, this would be a synchronized strike, occurring at 2 a.m. on the 29th of June. The 29th was no coincidence. This was St. Peter's Day, an ancient Christian holiday which commemorates the martyrdom of multiple saints. Thus, It was hoped that the religious significance and the undertones of sacrifice would inspire the Catholic and royal army to victory. Now, on the southern bank of the Loire, we find the so-called Army of the Marsh. Cooperating with his rivals, Charette opened fire on southern defences at about 2 a.m. So far, so good. Leading the smaller force of the two armies, Charette had two key objectives. The first was to seize the principal bridge which spanned the Loire into Nantes. The rebels needed this bridge to cross en masse, and so taking it was the first priority for this flank. But the second priority was simply drawing attention to this bridge. The defence was heavily outnumbered, and every soldier guarding this approach was one less to stop the main assault further north. Assisting the distraction was an advance from the east. This was led by a senior figure named Beauchamp, one of the officers who had actually recommended the initial prioritization of Brittany. Utilizing the main eastern road towards Paris, Beauchamp's troops likewise represented a genuine threat to the city. However, they too drew resources from the main offensive on the port's northwestern flank. But despite the timely cannonade from Charette's men south of the river, the main advance had gotten off to a rocky start. Generalissimo Quétineau wished to envelop the city before attacking it from the northwest. Coming from Angers and Saumur, the rebels had previously been east of Nantes, and that's where they hit a problem. While Nantes is on the northern bank of the Loire River, it's also split by the Erdre. A large tributary to the Loire, the Erdre essentially cuts the city into two halves. Consequently, to get to the northwestern side of Nantes, the army would have to cross it. With the river generally impassable, a bridge was required to do so. However, that was some 20 miles or 30 kilometres further north. This was a reasonable detour, and it turns out a costly delay. Thanks to unexpectedly dogged resistance by the bridge's outnumbered defenders, including the tinsmith Maurice, the royalist advance was late. Although planning to begin their offensive before dawn, the 2 a.m. assault was delayed until 10 a.m. Now, in the heat of the summer sun, not to mention broad daylight, things were not going to plan. Yet, despite these initial setbacks, the fierce fighting remained advantageous for the rebels. After all, Nantes was surrounded on multiple sides, and the royalists enjoyed an overwhelming numerical superiority. Advancing from the south, the east, and eventually the northwest, the city's dire situation looked increasingly bleak. But the revolutionaries' brave and capable leadership was making itself felt. For example, General Bessières rightly predicted that Charette's southern forces were more frightening than dangerous, and redirected troops away from the southern bridge to handle the main Vendéan army to the northwest. Likewise, Mayor Barcot was leading from the front, courageously smiling and cheerful even after he was wounded. With so many defenders being themselves raw recruits, the heroism of this prominent civilian was no doubt reassuring. I can't help but mention the rather humorous tale that as the injured Barcot was wheeled away on a cart, he shouted to the men that this was the chariot of victory. Bolstered by able command and a sincere belief that failure meant certain death, the Republican Blues were holding their ground. While disarray had condemned Saumur and abandoned Angers, this scene was one of dogged determination. Within hours, the royalist assault was slowing, and although the outcome remained uncertain, the fact that the defence had even made it past midday was itself a minor miracle. Frustrated by costly and insufficient progress, Generalissimo Quétineau decided on a new approach. Literally. In addition to utilising the northwestern road towards Rennes, the commander attempted to breach the city by an alternative road towards Vannes. With the defence stretched thin, a concentrated assault at another location may very well have proved decisive. But what was decisive was a well-placed bullet. As the royalists were making new gains, Catlino was shot. The Saint of Anjou was still alive, but only just. Nonetheless, rumours suggested otherwise. The invincible army was now rudderless, with its hero incapacitated. In short order, the already lacklustre offensive came to an abrupt halt. The Vendéans slowly disengaged. The city was saved. Had the rebels captured Nantes on the 29th of June, 1793, it may have granted them everything: foreign aid, allies in Brittany, a secure homeland to march on Paris. Instead, they had seized nothing, and worse was soon to come. Thank you for listening to episode 95, Nantes or Nothing. Don't miss the fantastic and infuriating episode extra for this episode called Generals and Guillotines. Of course, if you're enjoying Grey History, then why not support the show on patreon.com. Not only will you be able to listen to the great episode extra for this episode, but episode 94, Vendée Made in Paris, was a bonus episode exclusive for members of the community. So don't miss this and a range of other amazing community perks and help sponsor Grey History today. Thank you for listening, stay safe, and have a great day. Grey History is brought to you by its amazing community members, including the heroes of the Revolution, Brian, Charles, Jeff, Kevin R., Scott, Howard, Hilberto, Ron, and Kevin S. Joining the fantastic heroes are the amazing champions of the people: Cindy, George, William, Laura, Daniel, Monica, Adam, Tom, Eyal, Harold, David, Alistair, Jeff, Ritus, Cameron, Dan, Paul, Deborah, Danny, Gordon, Matthew, Sophia, Kevin, and Scott.